Welcome everyone to 4 Simple Ingredients, an educational evening about beer. We are excited to have KidsVoice supporters, board members, staff, and some new friends in the audience tonight. A very special thanks to all Guardian Society donors who are attending. We're thrilled and grateful to have Matthew Kurtas as our presenter tonight. Some of you may remember Matthew from his awesome presentation last year about fall wine trends and wine pairings. And Matthew has generously volunteered his time to help support the KidsVoice cause again. Matthew Kurtas is a dynamic speaker, enthusiastic leader, and merited mind in the hospitality industry. As one of 5 kids, he knows the importance of sharing, even when you want to, and team building to create harmony among diverse groups and strong egos. In his speaking engagements, he enjoys discussing employee engagement for millennials and wine programming in private clubs and restaurants. He has traveled the world to dance with over 1,000 strangers, walked on 800-degree fiery hot coals, jumped out of a moving airplane for fun, and has even climbed a few mountains. To top things off, Matthew celebrates the 11th anniversary this month of good health and recovery from brain surgery and a stroke. As a certified sommelier, that's a wine expert, and an author for the International Wine Society publication, The Grapevine, he has also consulted to 2 wineries, the Finger Lakes, for service staff training and marketing strategy. Matthew is currently the general manager of the prestigious Edgeworth Club in Sewickley, Pennsylvania. And in 2020, he was certified by his professional organization as a certified club manager. I'm excited to turn things over to Matthew. I'll note that midway through Matthew's presentation, we'll take a brief break from talking about beer, and Scott Hollander will give an update about KidsVoice. Take it away, Matthew, and welcome.
Thank you so much for that brilliant introduction. Just a lot of fun little tidbits in there. And I hope that if there's nothing else that comes across in tonight's presentation, it's that we all share not only the same enthusiasm for these 4 simple ingredients, but also for our community here in Pittsburgh. And KidsVoice is an absolutely critical part of that community. So to everybody here, I salute you and I toast to you. Let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. So we have 4 simple ingredients, the KidsVoice Brew School, and for every presentation which I give in the world of beverage, as you see here on the screen, a certified sommelier, that's a wine expert. I have the pleasure of making my audiences 3 different promises. And keep in mind that although my certification will be in wine expertise, and I am not a certified Cicerone, that would be a beer expert, the certification that I'm involved with as a certified sommelier covers the world of spirits, beer, rice wine, also called sake, and yes, even cigars. So it's a rather wide breadth this certifying body of knowledge is. And now, ladies and gentlemen, my 3 promises to you. Those are education, participation, and jubilation. Meaning that tonight you should learn something, that you should engage with your environment, ideally through see, smell, touch, hear, perhaps tasting some beer, and of course jubilation, because if you're enjoying a nice cold beer here at home tonight while you're on screen and you're not having a good time, perhaps I've not done my job correctly. So those are the 3 promises, and tonight's content are going to cover 3 different areas: beer basics and history. For those of you who just enjoy beer but don't really know how it's made or where it came from, this is a nice little primer for what we all came here for tonight. That's 4 simple ingredients. Those are the 4 ingredients that are in all beers. And then last but not least, we're going to give you a few PSAs, public service announcements, so you can keep your beer fresh and enjoy beer out and about. Without further ado, beer basics and history on our Cicerone's checklist. So beer basics, We have the first documented evidence of beer in 10,000 BC and even a little sooner. And the Sumerians were a population of people which were located in the very fertile beds that we now refer to as the Middle East, and even so far southwest of there, we have certain Egyptian cultures that also have evidence of beer. And this first beer was really an oops fermentation. And what does that mean? It was a spontaneous fermentation. There weren't beer makers yet as a hobby nor as a trade. What we really had were large buildings which were storehouses for grain, particularly wheat and barley, bulgur, other forms of grain which would grow in these fertile areas along riverbeds. And if the air was too moist, or let's say after a very heavy rain, the grain would start to sprout. And perhaps if there was even too much liquid, depending on how you stored your grain, the liquid may have leached out a little bit of sugar from the grain, and that sugar could have fermented into the earliest forms of beer. We have our first oops fermentation over 12,000 years ago. And now in 3000 BC, that's quite a wide leap, right? 7 millennia later, the Babylonians document using beer not only as a currency with one another, but also as rations. Yes, the government gave away beer. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the Babylonian Empire. So in 3000 BC, the documented history of beer moves from being a mistake to a very important part of commerce. The Egyptians use beer for sacred use in ritual. They even have gods and goddesses a millennia and a half later documented in their hieroglyphics, which we see in the tombs and the pyramids. And later on, the Roman Empire, which we know expanded from that Nile bed as far north as the UK, the Romans began taking that sacred use, which they also had sacred use of wine for sacrament, and they would use beer and wine, adding it to water for safety when they were on the road, specifically the soldiers. And the reason why is, although science was primitive in those days, the rate of infection in soldiers or populations that consumed more wine or beer than they consumed water was much lower. And this is because the alcohol helped sterilize the water that the troops would drink as they journeyed from one area to the next. So this beer moves its way from Mesopotamia and the Middle East further north, and we have in Germany, 1516 AD, one of the most critical parts of beer history, and it is so fun to say. I'll say it once, Reinheitsgebot. And if you're at home and you've got a cold brewski in your hand, I want you to raise it up to the screen. You can see me, but I can't see you. And we're going to say it together on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Reinheitsgebot. The Reinheitsgebot is a regulation law which comes into effect in Germany, which says all beer, which is pure beer, will have but 4 simple ingredients in it. Any type of brew or made beverage which breaks away from these 4 ingredients cannot be called beer in the country of Germany. The Reinheitsgebot is such an ingrained part of the German culture. Even the Bundepost, which is the post office in Germany, found a way to relive its history and display it proudly on the face of envelopes here with the 80-mark Reinheitsgebot commemorative stamp. So this is a very critical part as we move into the AD portion of modern history. We have a lot of religious involvement with beer and with wine over the next couple of centuries. You might think of Chimay beer. It comes from Trappist monks. We talk about a lot of Belgian beers and Belgian ales specifically being created by monks who would have to undergo tremendous fasts for long periods of time. And since they couldn't eat food, well, how did they fulfill themselves? How did they quench their thirst? And how did they keep their bellies full? Ladies and gentlemen, they kept a steady buzz for a very long time by brewing single strength, double strength, triple ales, and quadruple ales. These are the strong ales of Belgium. We have the industrialization of brewing as brewing makes its way over towards America. And last but not least, we have the modernization, the scientific perfection of this art, which we love to digest, beer. So the process of beer making, for those of you who have never done it before, and it can be done at home with just a few simple pieces of equipment, is really all not that complex. What you see here on the screen is a nice little flow chart, and I'm going to break down each of the steps even more simply for you. Mashing is a word that we use for combining malted grains such as barley, oats, even bulgur or quinoa in some cases. And we allow this to soak in water. We heat it up. We do what's called boiling. It's almost the same thing as making oatmeal. For those of you who have ever made Quaker oats at home, right? You add liquid, you add oats. What happens? The liquid's absorbed into. What happens when we make beer is that we add so much liquid that there's enough left over. We boil it very aggressively. And during this process, step 2, boiling, we add a few other ingredients, which we're going to review in the second part. That's going to include our hops. And the hops are going to add both aromas and bitterness, right? Aromas are on the nose, bitterness is on the palate. We have to cool down this liquid and remove all the solids. That's an unlisted step on here called racking. The last thing we do is fermentation, which is called, it's when we add yeast, specific strains of yeast for specific flavors in our beer making or in our beer brewing process. And the fermentation is when the yeast does its work and it turns all that beautiful sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Filtering is a step which isn't necessary, although many industrial beer makers do this for the clarity of the beer. And then lastly, of course, we have bottling or finishing. Sometimes beer goes into a bottle, sometimes it goes into a keg, other times a barrel. That's the dealer's choice. Ladies and gentlemen, consider yourself primed. In today's wonderful world of beer, we cherish that beer is nearly as complex, if not as complex, as the world of wine. For those of you who are familiar with the world of wine, you'll know of the wine wheel, which gives us a number of different flavors and scents which we can use to analyze the wine in order to create a common vocabulary with our peers, or just the guy or girl who's sitting next to us at the bar. Does that smell like grapefruit to you? Yeah, it smells like grapefruit to me. Well, the wine wheel has now transferred over to the world of beer. We have the beer wheel because the notes, aromas, bouquets, and flavors that beer are able to express, these are just as complex. They are just as numerous as those in wine. And that is because of our 4 wonderful, simple ingredients. So let's tear right into it. Whereas wine uses grapes and yeast only in the production of it, it is an agricultural product, which is really an expression of just one vintage or one particular year. Beer is quite different. Beer is fairly consistent from one year to the next, and that's because, unlike wine, beer is made to a recipe. The 4 simple ingredients, which were marked in 1516 AD as part of the Reinheitsgebot, include water, hops, barley or malted grain, and yeast. We're going to review each of these in order, and we're going to take a small break between hops and barley to hear from our fearless executive director, Scott Hollander. Beginning with water, ladies and gentlemen. Water is absolutely critical to making beer because, like I said, we're effectively making oatmeal, right? And in order to do that, we have to have water. Now, I can't see you, but you can see me, so I don't need to ask by a show of hands. But I'd like for anybody who's traveled abroad to think about having Guinness in Ireland, or if you've ever had the experience of having Heineken in Amsterdam. Perhaps it just tasted better or different, and maybe that was the environment. But in reality, Heineken is made to a recipe. Guinness is made to a recipe. And when it's brewed domestically in the UK, or in Ireland rather for Guinness, right, we are using water from Ireland. And when we make Guinness to the same recipe at beer making facilities here in the United States, we use water sourced from the United States. So the water that we use in that initial mash and in that boil is absolutely critical. The minerality in the water is very important. A high mineral content gives us a good flavor. Minerality could be calcium. Sometimes too much calcium gives you lime in your pipes. You think about that, but it has a very distinct taste. It affects the texture of the water if you think of soft or hard water, if you've ever stayed in a hotel with one or the other. So the minerality is really key. When making beer, we do prefer water to be more on the mineral side than we prefer it to be on the less mineral side. The second part of the water that we really cherish is that the nutrients that are naturally in the water, if it comes maybe from a spring, are critical to helping the yeast do their job. Yeast is one of those 4 ingredients. And last but not least, when it comes to water, purity of additives or chemicals is absolutely essential. So we don't prefer to use tap water because tap water here in the United States, if you're home brewing, Tap water is going to contain trace amounts of perhaps chlorine or even fluoride, and that's to keep our teeth strong and keep the water sanitary, but that comes through in the beer. So when possible, purified water or spring water should be used in those facilities, even if they are your kitchen, when and where you make beer. Now, I do see a couple people commenting here about serving the Guinness or the Heineken much warmer abroad, and that is the truth as well. That is a bit of a European tradition, but we shall continue forward. And those questions which are coming into the Q&A box, we are going to address those at the finale of the presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, moving into the second of our 4 prime ingredients are hops. And here you have on the screen a picture of hops. Hops are quite a fascinating plant. They are both a medicinal plant as well as a food plant. Hops are related to marijuana. They are part of a very special form of plant which offers wonderful essential oils. And these essential oils are really what make beers have spectacular noses or flavors on the palate. Hops add flavor in a couple of different ways. And here we see hops in their prime form. This is how they grow. They look like teensy tiny green pine cones, and they grow on a vine as opposed to on an evergreen tree. Some of the greatest hop growing facilities are in Washington State as well as in New York State. This is why both of those states have great traditions of beer making. Here we have a slide on the right, just so that way you can see, like that beer wheel that we studied earlier. We have a number of different species of hops, and each of them expresses differently. Some of them are spicy, some of them are fruity, some of them are herbal, some of them are smack dab right in the middle there. And to the left, you see a schooner ship. And you might be thinking, well, what on earth does a naval ship have anything to do with hops? Well, this will be one of our fun, small branches off of the initial topic. Instead of talking about hops, I'd like to talk to you about the spice trade. And back when the spice trade was most popular between Britain and India, or Britain and China, sailors would have long voyages all the way around Africa, past the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean. And just like we talked about, the Romans would clean their water using their beer, the English sailors leaned on this knowledge that beer was safer to drink than water. However, beer still spoils if kept too long. The British sailors and the British brewers at the time of the spice trade's peak noticed that adding hops offered additional sterility and duration to the beer, meaning the more hops we put into the beer, the longer it's going to stay safe to drink. Hops have microbial essential oils. These microbial oils prevent bacteria from spreading or other life forms that you don't want in your beer or that you don't want on a surface, which is why hops are used for medicine as much as they're used for making beer. Now, how does this have to do with the schooner on the left side of the screen? Well, we have the spice trade to the Indian Ocean. We have beer that's nearly about to spoil. We have the British adding barrels and barrels of hops to their barrels of beer. And they named this incredibly hoppy, fragrant beer India Pale Ale. So ladies and gentlemen, if you've ever had an IPA or you favor an IPA and you thought perhaps it's because the beer is from India or the recipe for the beer is Indian inspired, simply not true. The fact of the matter is it's a British tradition which was created out of necessity to create a safe drinking and sailing environment for those on the spice trade. We'll continue forward. When we try beer that has hops in it, we might notice that the beer is more bitter. Now, most beers have hops. Some beers have more hops than others. You can see on the screen here, the IBU scale is International Bitterness Units. And we start as low as 0, which is imperceptibly bitter, all the way up to 100, which is so incredibly bitter, it would be like sucking on an ibuprofen. I'd like everybody to reflect back to an incredibly bitter and unpleasant medicinal experience. Now, those beers which are in the middle in that 50 and 60 range, that's where the majority of America's IPAs hang out. And then some of those standard light beers, you'll see they're 10 and under. So this IBU scale is pretty important because the amount of hops that we add affects the bitterness of the beer. Now, if you are going to be beer making or brewing at home brewing, I'd like you to remember SPF. And no, we're not talking about a day at the beach. SPF for hops particularly is very important. S stands for schedule. When you add the hops really matters in the boil portion of brewing beer. Remember, we talked about mashing the grains first and then bringing it up to temperature, and that's when we add the hops. So when we schedule the hops for addition really matters. Second is the plant pedigree. The species or the pedigree of hops that you add will have different flavors or smells than other species. So the pedigree matters. And lastly, the format of the hops matters. The hops could be ground or they could be whole cone. They could be pelletized, and we'll see pictures of those shortly. So here is just a very scientific picture, which I'm going to summarize for you in but one sentence. Adding hops at the beginning of the boil leads to a bitter beer, and adding hops at the end of the boil leads to a fragrant beer. Once more, adding hops at the beginning, where they continue to boil and extract essential oils because they're boiling for longer. We boil the beer for, sometimes you can see 90 minutes on the screen. That's going to lead to a lot of bitterness in the beer, regardless of which species you choose for the hops. And if you add them just towards the end, only those most pleasant, lightest extracted flavors and aromas will come through. That's how we get the very nice nose on many of the IPAs that we enjoy today. So the second thing we talked about was pedigree, and we saw on our beautiful diagram there that different pedigrees of hops offer different flavors and smells. Maybe if you looked at the side of your craft brew recently, you've seen the word Cascade hops, Chinook hops, Simcoe hops. They're referring to different species, just like in wine. We have Cabernet as a grape, right? We have Pinot Noir as a grape, Merlot. They're all red, but they're different species. Same thing for hops. Last but not least, the format matters. And here you can see from left to right on the screen, we have coniferous hops or whole hops. In the middle, we have pelletized hops. These are ground hops, which are then pressed back together with a coagulation agent. And then on the right, we have ground hops. Now, if we add hops in a finer format, like all the way on the right, the ground hops, that's going to yield more intense flavors, whether that's bitterness or aromas, depending on when you add them. Once more, the finer the grind, the more intense the flavor. And that simply has to do with the dissolving factor. It's almost as if the surface area of liquid around that tiny little bit of hop gets a deeper extraction than when we leave it whole in a cone. So we're going to hop onto a second part of the presentation here. I'd really like to invite our fearless executive director, Scott Hollander, to share a few words on the state of KidsVoice. I'll go on mute now.
Thanks, Matthew. And I just want to thank everyone else for joining us this evening. It's a chance for our supporters and others in the community to learn a little more about KidsVoice, to learn more about beer from Matthew, who also did such a great job last year on our wine program. And our donors tonight include many of our Guardian Society members, some of our higher level donors. And the combination of all of you have really supported us this year during the pandemic, have made it possible for us to take on some new things for our clients and sustain the core work of what we do. For those of you who don't know KidsVoice, we provide legal representation and advocacy to about 3,000 children each year who are involved in Allegheny County juvenile court cases, what we call dependency cases, or abuse and neglect cases, because their parents weren't able to provide a minimally adequate level of care. About 2,000 of those youth end up in foster care, and we advocate for them using a team of lawyers and social service professionals, people with backgrounds in social work and child development, drug and alcohol treatment, and other areas to really design a uniquely tailored plan for each child and family with the hopes that their parents can address their issues and have the children come back home. We also stay with our clients until they turn 25, even after the child welfare case ends or the foster care ends. So we can help them as they transition to adulthood with issues like housing and credit. And some of them have disability and Social Security or have mental health and other problems that are really challenging as they age out of the system. This has been an extraordinarily difficult time during the pandemic for our clients. They have a tough enough road to hoe in regular times, but it's during this period, the economic issues have really affected our clients disproportionately. There has been as everyone's probably aware, a great increase in addiction, and that creates more neglect due to drugs. Many of our clients have trauma, mental health, and need treatment. It's been very hard to get to a therapist, see anyone in person. Some of our clients have not had even the Wi-Fi access to do virtual mental health treatment. And for some of them, that's not really what they need. It's been harder to find foster homes and supports and services. And certainly schools have been difficult for everyone. So in this backdrop, it's just taken a lot more effort, focus, challenge. The cases it's just more difficult. And our staff have done a fabulous job. They've really stepped up during this time to do more for our clients while also managing their own challenges in their lives with the pandemic, with their homes, their families. Many of them have school-age children. And I think anyone here with children in school knows that this calendar year, 2021, and also going back into 2020, has been challenging even for the best of students. For most of our schools, this January through June was just a continuation of virtual or hybrid learning. Our biggest school district, Pittsburgh Public Schools, where we have the most clients, only had students return for 12 days by June. So that was all they had over almost 18 months. They came twice a week in May and June of last year. And the transition back to school this fall has not been easy for our clients. And it's even harder because many of them have learning disabilities, which were not addressed during the pandemic. It was hard enough for schools to just provide basic education, let alone the special education supports that our clients needed. Those didn't happen over that 1.5 year period, and our clients fell further and further behind. And so returning to school this year when they have feel further behind has been tough. One of the things our staff has done in response is they've just launched this fall our pandemic education response team. It's a specialized team that's really focusing on our clients who have special education needs to take advantage of some of the guidelines from the Pennsylvania Department of Education that requires school districts to step up and provide recoupment services for youth who didn't get their needs met so far during the pandemic. So we're planning this for 2 years to really dog the districts over about a 2-year period, make sure plans are in place, special education supports are met, each quarter checking in to see how our clients are doing and whether the districts are providing what they need, and hopefully getting them caught back up over that time period, which we think could take at least 2 academic years. We're also very focused on our seniors this year who may not have had what they needed during the pandemic to get all their credits, and so they can recover those credits, graduate with their class, and move on in their lives. It's also been an extremely difficult time for our clients who are transitioning out of foster care. They don't have families, they don't have a safety net. It's been a very difficult time for them to navigate housing and other systems. And some of our clients who are transitioning out of the foster care system and trying to live independently have children of their own. And that makes things even more challenging. In response to that, we have a 2-generation advocacy program where we support our former clients in addressing their needs, but also their children's needs. Some of their children have developmental delays, and they need help in terms of getting pre-K or Head Start programs to address those delays. That in turn provides 5-day-a-week daycare, or for other clients just to get subsidized daycare so that the adults clients of ours who are trying to transition out and care for their kids can get to work, can get to a job training program, and can make ends meet. So we've really done a great job of that program. It's fairly new for us. It grew a lot in the past year. We're hoping to double or even triple that this year. I wanted to talk about one really neat new thing that we have with Pittsburgh Steelers safety, Minka Fitzpatrick. He has launched his own foundation and kicked that off this spring in May by giving 35 of our clients bikes and new shoes and bike helmets so they could have a better summer, particularly coming off the pandemic. He also and his mother Melissa really have a connection to KidsVoice because of our 2-generation advocacy program I was just mentioning. Minka's mom had him when she was very young, and they understand the kind of support that's needed for young parents to be successful in the world and keep their children safe and to be able to flourish. And so they have decided to support our 2-generation advocacy program. And part of that is Minka's launched his Tackle Child Abuse campaign that some of you may have heard of or may even be participating in. He's donating money himself, but also asking people to join him. And he's raised about $50,000 already by having people pledge $39. That's his number per tackle he makes, and for every turnover the Pittsburgh Steelers defense has this year. And it's really been a wonderful way to highlight that. And a portion of those funds are dedicated just to our 2-generation program and other parts to KidsVoice. I just want to highlight one quick story of a young mother who reached out to us because she had a minor summary offense that she needed our help with, which we were able to have dismissed after she did some community service. She has 3 children, 3, 2, and 1. And that was the help that she needed. And she wanted to keep her record clean so she could get jobs, be able to get housing. And then she reached back out to us a little later on a Friday night because she didn't have what she needed for her kids, and didn't have food, didn't have formula, and was really worried about what to do. And we were able to set her up that evening with our staff running out and getting supplies. And this young woman was really afraid to share the help that she needed for fear that her children would be taken away. And we were able to put a number of things in place for her. And one of these things that we learned is that she had an apartment out in Keysport, and that wasn't, and she had a car, but her former boyfriend with whom she had the children was abusive. He had taken her car, he had wrecked it, he had broken some windows in the apartment, and so her landlord wanted her out. She couldn't make it to work easily and couldn't get her kids to daycare promptly after work, and so had to run up late fees at daycare, was fired from her job, and was really just worried about a lot of different things. We helped her get new housing. We helped her get a job. She basically was a COVID tracer for the county and did well there, got a promotion, and really is doing much better. And she was able to move into that housing, had very little for her children for the summer. And Minka surprised her at that event with hundreds of dollars worth of outdoor toys and books and games so that they could have those things for their summer. So that was a really nice thing he did. The last thing I wanted to mention is our magistrate district judge work, where we have been, like we talked about in that case, this young woman had a minor offense before a magistrate district judge. It could be a disturbing the peace charge or something along those lines, where most people, if they showed up with a parent or a lawyer, would get no consequence, community service. But our clients don't often show up. They end up with $300 fine and $150 in court costs they can't pay. And then they can go to jail for that and then have a criminal record. So we've been able to be very successful in those cases. We have over a 74% success rate compared to about 30% for other former foster youth who don't have our help. And it's been a very successful program. It's being replicated now in the Allegheny County Public Defender's Office this year. They were able to get grant funding to hire one attorney who we helped them both to obtain that grant and get that person up and trained. And just last week, the Penn State Dickinson Law School in Carlisle had its first successful MDJ case with our help and is looking to grow that program in Cumberland County. So those are the kinds of things that your support help us to do. And on behalf of our staff and our board, I just want to thank everyone for being there for our clients and for KidsVoice during this very challenging year.
Scott, thank you so much for that update. It is so good to know that there are people caring in our communities and helping people in a year which has just been filled with unfathomable and unforeseen circumstances. To know that there's someone on your side means so much. And we're so glad that you do what you do. So thank you. And I'm going to pick up where we left off. We're going to be moving into our next ingredient from the Reinheitsgebot. And it is malted barley. And barley itself is a grain right? Just the way it's a cereal grain, the way that corn is a grain, or rye is a grain, or wheat is a grain. And malted simply refers to a process where we allow this teensy tiny grain to begin to sprout. We give it water, we maybe give it a little bit of light, and it thinks, we've got a shot, I'm gonna turn into a beautiful stalk of barley someday. Well, what we do is after it's germinated is we roast it. And the depth to which we roast it is what you see here on the screen. That's the malting process. What happens is these grains have long carbohydrate chains. And by giving them the opportunity to sprout and then roasting them for flavor, we caramelize and shorten some of those complex carbohydrates into really tasty sweet sugars. And those really dark malts, all the way on the right, you see roaster malts. Those are the kind of malts that we use in something like Guinness. And the base malts that you see all the way to the left of this scale, those are the types of malts that we'll use most often with a light beer, like an IC Light or a Bud Light or a Miller Light or a Coors Light. Now, the scale that we use to measure the darkness of our roast, just think about like a coffee has a dark roast or a medium roast. It's called the Lovibond scale. And you can see from here, value 2 all the way to 38. It is really just a color-based scale. Now, it is possible to use other cereal grains, such as corn, such as wheat, such as oats, and these will affect the texture and the flavor of the beer vastly. However, in the country of Germany, to be beer, it's got to be barley, according to the Reinheitsgebot. So, just a few other types of grains which today's brewers and brewers in other countries are using. Wheat helps give beer a little bit of a haze. So if you're familiar with a Hefeweizen, that is a half wheat is the translation there. So wheat gives a haze and a bit of a creamy or a more full mouthfeel. It's a little bit less crisp and a little bit more like, oh man, I feel like I just drank a loaf of bread. That's what wheat adds. Now you can see barley here. Corn adds sweetness. Rye adds a little bit of spiciness. A few others here, millet and rice, are technically grains. These are often used in very light beers. Land Shark is one of them. So ladies and gentlemen, drink your whole grain diet. And last but not least, our final of 4 ingredients, yeast. And you might be looking at the screen thinking, what the heck, yeast are like babies? Well, what I'm about to teach you is probably one of the more unforgettable components of tonight's presentation, because we promised you 3 things and we're going to deliver on all of them, right? Participation, education, jubilation. Yeast are like babies because in my experience as an uncle of 5 of them, they do just about 3 things. And I could use the chat feature here, but to keep things moving along, I'm going to break the news. Babies do 3 things. They eat, they cry, and they go to the bathroom. And the reason why yeast are like babies is that yeast do the same 3 things. Yeast eat sugar, which come from the malted barley, right? It's in the liquid because we've done the mash, we've done the boil, we've cooled it down, we add the yeast. Now it's eating all that beautiful sugar, that maltose, and then it's crying out, it's wailing like a small child. And that's the carbon dioxide. Think of how red in the face a young child or a newborn is that first time it really cries. Yeast, as they're eating all of this sugar, they're outputting carbon dioxide. And in some cases, we have an open tank, we let it go into the atmosphere. In other cases, we close the tank and it's like a pressure cooker. And this keeps the carbon dioxide in the liquid. And then in a third case, we actually recapture it. Maybe we use it to carbonate soda further down the line in another industry. So in our 4 ingredients, yeast is the final one, and frankly, among the most important, because without yeast, fermentation could not occur. Now, there are natural-born yeasts, airborne yeasts that are in the air that you and I breathe. They're on our skin. They're everywhere. This is what was witnessed in 10,000 BC when the Sumerians had their first beers. They didn't put a block of yeast like you and I can pick up at the grocery store to make our loaf of bread into a vat of grains. No, the yeast that's naturally occurring spontaneously fermented, eating sugar, which was left in a pile of residue where they stored grain. So yeast can cause a fermentation naturally, which is the case with some really, really funky styles of Belgian beers. And yeast can be something that we inoculate or we do on purpose to control the flavor. And that's the case in a really industrialized beer setting. Now, there was one question which did come in, and I promised I was going to keep a couple of these things till the end, but I did want to answer it live here and now because we are talking about alcohol. And the question was, I've tried some really great non-alcoholic IPAs. Can you talk a little bit about that? Well, we learned that the IPA style and the bitterness and the floralness comes from the hops, and the alcohol obviously comes from the yeast. So how is it that we're making a non-alcoholic IPA? Well, a few simple methods. Number one is we are brewing our malt. We're adding our hops and we're getting all those flavors. And then we are force carbonating that liquid the same way that we carbonate soda from a fountain. That's number one. Number two is we're going to do a yeast fermentation and we're going to make an alcoholic beer. And then we're going to boil off the alcohol. We might lose a couple other flavors when we do that too, because they evaporate at the same temperature as alcohol. And then the third method, which is the most common industrial method, is something that's called reverse osmosis. And it uses a machine that's bigger than my dining room in order to extract the alcohol through a membrane and let all the other good stuff in. So to answer your question there, buddy, that is how some of the non-alcoholic IPAs are made. And if you've been tuning in recently, the Athletic Brewing Company was recently featured on the Weekend Today show. They are one of the producers of a really great non-alcoholic IPA, and I do recommend them. I've not been paid for their endorsement, mind you. Now, yeast is also fairly important because there are different species of it. We talked about inoculating yeast on purpose or having spontaneous yeast. Lager and ale are two separate styles of beer, and it has nothing to do with the color. It's not that all dark beers are ales and all light beers are lagers. As a matter of fact, the distinguishing factor between lagers and ales is the species of yeast that we use. In lagers, the yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, Saccharomyces uvum, and in ales, it's Saccharomyces cerevisiae. The cerevisiae yeast likes to operate in a warmer temperature, and because the beer is warmer and it's bubbling more, ale yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, floats to the top. Ale yeast hangs out up here, as you can see. Lager yeast, which is Saccharomyces uvum, tends to sink down to the bottom and become weighed down. It operates and does its processing. It's eating up sugar, it's whaling out of carbon dioxide, and its production of alcohol. It does all of those things at a bit of a slower pace, and it does it at the bottom of a fermentation vessel. So that's a little bit about the yeast. Here you can see some different styles of beer. Lagers can be all colors, ales can be all colors, right? And it's because it has nothing to do with the malts. It all has to do with the yeast. And Buddy actually reports back in drinking an Athletic Brewing non-alcoholic IPA right now. Buddy, you go, man. I am so glad to hear that. We're going to keep moving forward into our PSAs so that way we can bring the presentation home. I'm sure each and every one of you is dying to get a little dinner to fill those bellies after having one or two brewskis. So we're going to talk about pairing beer with food the way that we pair wine with food. So just like we use a general rule of thumb, and keep in mind, there are exceptions to every rule. White wine traditionally goes with white proteins, such as white meat, chicken or poultry or fish. Whereas light-bodied beers, we're going to say the same thing, stick with lighter proteins or sauces. Now, there are plenty of people who love a heavy, big glass of Cab with a Dover sole, and that's just because they're Cab fans. So I always tell every person, as a certified sommelier, I'm not in the business of selling expensive wine or fine wine. I am in the business of helping people unlock their passions for beverage. So the best wine for your food tonight is the wine that you like best, and the same can be said for beer. The best beer to pair with your meal tonight is the beer that you like best. Right? Now with the red wine, we say red meat or protein, darker or heavier proteins, pork will qualify in some cases here as well. We do the same thing for those heavier body beers you can see on the left side of the screen. Last but not least, I always tell everybody in the world of wine, champagne goes with everything, and I promise Mrs. Kurtas would agree. Champagne goes with everything. Plain lager or ale, light beers, have that crispness. There is a good flavor, but it's not an abundance of complexity. So if you're just kicking it, a light beer for a pairing does just as well, or a light ale does just as well as does anything else. Now, our final PSA, our second PSA this evening, is about beer freshness. So Perhaps you have seen Mr. Pepe Le Pew here on the left side of the screen. And Pepe Le Pew represents everything that we do not like about certain beers, and that is skunkiness. And many of you asked in advance, or you've maybe wondered, how does beer skunk? And I'll have you observe closely now on the right side of the screen, 3 different beers, each of them with their own unique aromas and flavors: Corona, Heineken, Pacifico. Now, the comments feature is live, but in the essence of keeping the presentation moving, I would ordinarily at this point ask what's different about these beers. And some would say, well, Corona comes from Mexico, Heineken comes from Holland, and Pacifico, I believe, comes from, we're Cerveza Pacifico, we're over here in Mexico again, so maybe it's not the country. Well, I'm going to cut to the chase. It's the glass. Again, it's the glass. Corona is in a clear glass bottle. Heineken is in a green glass bottle. Pacifico is in a brown glass bottle. And this is very important because what skunks beer is light, which means it is impossible to skunk a can of beer because light cannot get in. However, we know that clear glass lets light through almost perfectly. Green glass, through properties of reflection and refraction, reflection and refraction. You learned those in physics back in 10th grade, right? Bends light, lets fewer light rays in, and the brown glass, well, that does the best refraction, and that's going to prevent the light from spoiling the beer. You see, when we add hops, part of those microbial agents include what we call beta acid blockers. And the light destroys them and changes the composition of the beer. So it's impossible to skunk a can of beer. However, it is possible for a can of beer to simply be old and tasting stale, which is different than skunky. I think we can all agree that Pepe Le Pew scent. So some rules of thumb for freshness of beer. For those beers that you're keeping at room temperature, we recommend as a beverage community no more than 6 months after date for service. And for those which you're keeping at a very cold temperature storage, that's going to be like your refrigerator at 38. We say really as far as 2 years after date is the latest you'd want to drink those beers. But it is all about the rate of oxygenation and acid breakdown. So if it is in a dark place at room temperature, you may have a little bit of flexibility. And if it is in the refrigerator, obviously we say err on more time than less, because that's a dark refrigerator once you close the doors. Now, the date which is on the bottom of a can or on a box may be a bit confusing. Sometimes it's a production date, sometimes it's a best buy date. It's different for every brand. And to give you an encyclopedia in this presentation, we'd be here until Thanksgiving. So I do recommend, if you're that interested in how long you should keep your beer, just put it in the fridge. 2 years is long enough, ladies and gentlemen. So with that said, there was but one more question which came in advance, which I'd like to address, and then we'll open up for any questions live here in the group. So the question which came in was from one of our Guardian Circle presenters, and it asked about the differences between New England IPAs out here on the East Coast and West Coast IPAs, which are familiar to us from Washington, Oregon, California, so on and so forth. So for the gentleman who asked this question, to put it in summary, hazy IPAs or New England IPAs are often referred to as hazy because wheat is added as a malted grain in addition to the barley. And that's going to give it a haziness like a Hefeweizen, like a Blue Moon, a cloudiness. It's going to add a little bit more body. The IPAs from the West Coast usually shy away from that. They stick to barley, sometimes a few other added grains, but they mostly stick to barley, so they're a little crisper. Now, when we add the hops also matters. We talked about that earlier. And in the New England, or the hazy IPAs, as we call them, we often add the hops later on. It's all about the aromas. Whereas with the West Coast, it's big, it's bad, it's personality, it's bitter. We add those hops in mass quantities, and we add them very early on in the boil. So what happens is we have both a fragrant and a bitter beer on the West Coast. And on the East Coast, we have one with a greater mouthfeel, a better texture because of the add of wheat, and also because we have that late addition of the hops.